The transport truck dropped me off at the gate around 10 in the morning, kicking up a cloud of dust that took several minutes to settle in the still desert air. I grabbed my duffel bag from the truck bed and walked toward what had to be the most underwhelming military installation I'd ever seen. The outpost looked like it had been forgotten by whoever designed it. A cluster of flat-roofed concrete buildings sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by chain-link fencing that showed rust stains where the desert wind had worn away the coating. 2 guard towers flanked the main gate, but they looked empty. No movement in the windows, no signs that anyone had been up there in months. I showed my orders to the gate guard, who barely glanced at the paperwork before waving me through. The guy looked bored out of his mind, like he'd been sitting in that booth since the place was built. Walking across the compound, I counted maybe 6 buildings total. The largest one had to be the main operations center, with a radio antenna stretching up from its roof. The others looked like barracks, storage, and what might have been a mess hall. Everything had that weathered look you get when concrete sits in the desert sun for too long. My orders directed me to Building C for quarters assignment. Inside, a tired-looking corporal handed me a key and pointed down a hallway. Room 12. You're sharing with Meyer. The hallway stretched longer than I expected, with numbered doors on both sides. Most of them looked closed up, no sounds coming from behind the metal. When I reached 12, I knocked once and pushed the door open. The room was basic military standard. 2 narrow bunks, 2 foot lockers, 2 small desks pushed against opposite walls. A man sat on the far bunk with his back to me, hunched over something in his lap. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and wore fatigues that looked like they'd seen a lot more use than mine. "Michael Meyer?" I said. He looked up without moving his body, just turned his head enough to see me. Gray eyes that looked me over in about 2 seconds. Then he went back to what he was doing. I stepped closer and saw he was cleaning a rifle. Not just cleaning it, but going over every part with the kind of attention you'd use for defusing bombs. His movements were precise and repetitive, like he'd done this exact same routine thousands of times. "I'm David Thompson. Looks like we're roommates." "Yeah." He didn't look up again. I dropped my duffel on the empty bunk and started unpacking. Meyer kept working on his weapon, checking each part before putting it back together with a practiced hand. The silence went on long enough to get awkward. "So, what's the mission here?" I asked, pulling out my spare uniforms. Orders just said perimeter security and equipment monitoring. Meyer finished with the rifle and set it aside, immediately reaching for a sidearm. "That's about right. Pretty quiet place. Usually." I hung up my shirts and tried a different approach. "How long have you been stationed here?" 2 years, 4 months. The way he said it made it sound like he'd been counting days. I looked around the room again, noticing details I'd missed. Strong locks on both the door and windows. The windows themselves had thick metal blinds, the kind you'd see in a bunker rather than regular barracks. "Must get boring out here with just a few guys." Meyer paused in his weapon cleaning and glanced at me. "Few guys?" "I mean, I didn't see many people around. How big is the complement here?" "Changes." That was the longest conversation I'd had since arriving, and it hadn't exactly been illuminating. I finished unpacking and decided to explore the base. Meyer didn't acknowledge me leaving. The compound was bigger than it looked from the gate, but not by much. I found the mess hall, which served food that tasted like it had been shipped in from 3 states away. 2 other soldiers sat at separate tables, eating in silence. They nodded when I said hello, but didn't seem interested in conversation. The operations center was locked, with a sign directing all inquiries to the duty officer. I couldn't find anyone who fit that description. By late afternoon, I'd walked the entire perimeter and confirmed what I'd suspected. This place was running on a skeleton crew, maybe 8 or 10 people total, and half of them seemed to be avoiding everyone else. I went back to the barracks to find Meyer exactly where I'd left him, except now he was working on a different rifle. This one looked newer, but he was giving it the same obsessive attention. "Pretty thorough maintenance schedule," I said. He looked up and for the first time showed something that might have been amusement. You could say that. Mind if I ask why? This place doesn't exactly look like a combat zone. Meyer set down the rifle and started checking the locks on our door. He tested the deadbolt, then the handle, then tried the deadbolt again. After that, he moved to the windows and did the same thing with those locks. What are you doing? Checking security. Security for what? We're in the middle of nowhere. Meyer finished with the windows and started organizing his gear. Everything had a specific place, arranged with the kind of precision that suggested he'd done this routine many times before. You ever been deployed somewhere remote before? He asked. Yeah, plenty of times. But I've never seen anyone check door locks like they were guarding Fort Knox. Different places have different requirements. I sat on my bunk and watched him work. There was something weird about his movements, like he was preparing for something specific. Not just general military readiness, but getting ready for a particular type of threat. What kind of requirements? Meyer stopped arranging his gear and looked at me directly. His face had no expression, just those gray eyes studying me like he was trying to decide something. There are certain rules that need to be followed once the sun goes down. I waited for him to explain more, but he just went back to getting ready. The way he said it didn't sound like normal procedure. It sounded personal, like he was talking about something he'd learned the hard way. What kind of rules? The kind that keep you alive. That got my attention. I leaned forward, expecting him to explain, but Meyer just continued organizing his equipment. He put everything back in the exact same spots as before, super precise about it. Are you trying to mess with the new guy? Because if this is some kind of hazing thing... Meyer looked at me again, and this time his expression was completely serious. Not joking, not trying to scare me, just matter of fact. Do I look like someone who jokes around? He had a point. In the few hours I'd known him, Meyer hadn't shown much personality at all. Just this mechanical efficiency and constant weapon maintenance. But rules for after sunset, at a monitoring station in Nevada. It sounded exactly like the kind of thing experienced soldiers used to mess with new arrivals. Make the rookie nervous. Tell him stories about mysterious threats. Watch him jump at shadows for a few weeks. I lay back on my bunk and decided not to take the bait. Whatever Meyer was planning, I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me worried about imaginary dangers in the desert. I spent most of the afternoon trying to figure out what kind of operation we were really running here. The more I looked around the compound, the less sense it made. Equipment monitoring and perimeter security didn't require this level of isolation or the skeleton crew approach. Something about the whole setup felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. Meyer stayed in our room going through different weapons like he was getting ready for an invasion. Every rifle, every sidearm, every piece of gear got the same obsessive attention. I'd seen thorough maintenance before, but this was something else entirely. This was preparation. Around 5 in the evening, he finally put down the last weapon and looked at me directly. We need to go over some things before dark. He reached into his footlocker and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. The edges were worn from handling, and the writing looked like it had been done in pencil, then traced over multiple times with different pens. He held it out to me. Read this. Memorize it. I took the paper and looked down at what seemed to be a handwritten list. 5 numbered items in block letters written super carefully like it was something important. 1. Stay inside after sunset, no exceptions. 2. Lock barracks door by 11 p.m. Check twice. 3. Never look out windows after midnight. 4. If someone knocks, make them say your full name first. 5. If alarm sounds, get under bed and stay there. I read through the list twice, waiting for Meyer to smile or show me it was just a joke. When I looked up, his face had the same serious expression he'd had all day. Are you serious with this? Completely. Meyer, come on. This reads like something out of a horror movie. What's next? Don't feed them after midnight? He didn't even blink. Those rules aren't suggestions. They're requirements. I looked down at the paper again, then back at him. The guy had been cleaning weapons for hours with the focus of someone preparing for combat. And now he was handing me what looked like supernatural survival tips written by a paranoid teenager. Requirements for what? For staying alive. I laughed. I couldn't help it. The whole situation had crossed from mysterious into ridiculous. Okay, I get it. This is the part where you try to spook the new guy. Make him think there are monsters in the desert or whatever, but I'm not buying it. Meyer stared at me for a long moment, then walked over to his bunk and sat down. He picked up his sidearm and started checking the magazine, doing it the same careful way he did everything. "Keep the list," he said without looking up. "You'll need it." Before I could respond, voices carried from outside our window. I moved to the blinds and looked through a gap to see 4 soldiers walking toward the main gate. They were dressed in full gear with rifles slung over their shoulders, moving with the casual confidence of people heading out on routine patrol. "Where are they going?" I asked. Meyer joined me at the window, though he stayed well back from the glass. "Perimeter check. They do it every evening." "Standard patrol?" "Something like that." I watched the 4 men reach the gate. The guard waved them through without any paperwork or radio calls, like this was expected. They walked out into the desert, their voices carrying back on the still air as they discussed routes and timing. "How long are they usually out?" Meyer moved away from the window and started organizing his gear again. "Depends." "On what?" "On whether they come back." That stopped me cold. I turned away from the window to face him. "What do you mean, whether they come back?" "Sometimes patrols don't return." Meyer looked at me with that same measuring expression he'd had when I first walked into the room, like he was trying to decide how much truth I could handle. "I mean, they don't come back." The casual way he said it made my skin crawl, not because I believed whatever story he was building, but because he seemed to believe it completely. There was no doubt in his voice, no indication that he was trying to mess with me, just matter-of-fact acceptance of something that made no sense. "Meyer, soldiers don't just disappear. If there's a real threat out there, there is. Then why aren't we doing something about it? Why aren't we calling for backup or evacuating or..." "Because that's not how this works." He finished setting up his equipment and started checking the locks on our door. First the handle, then the deadbolt, then both again. The same routine I'd watched him do earlier. But now it felt different. Now it felt like he was getting ready for something specific. "Don't follow them," he said, still working on the locks. "Don't try to make radio contact after dark. Don't go outside for any reason." I looked back out the window. The 4 soldiers were already several hundred yards from the fence, getting smaller as they walked into the open desert. Their flashlights weren't on yet, but each man had one clipped to his belt. "This is insane. You're talking like we're under siege." "We are." "By what?" Meyer finished with the locks and moved to the windows. He checked each one twice, making sure the heavy metal blinds were secure and the latches were engaged. "You'll find out soon enough." I wanted to keep arguing, to force him to explain what he thought was hunting us in the middle of nowhere. But something about how he acted made me hesitate. This wasn't the behavior of someone playing a prank. This was someone following a routine he'd learned from experience. The radio in the communications room crackled to life, drawing my attention away from Meyer's preparations. I could hear the patrol checking in, their voices clear and professional as they reported their position and status. Normal military procedure. "I'm going to monitor their communications," I said. Meyer looked up from the window locks. "Don't." "Why not?" "Because you won't like what you hear." I ignored him and walked out of the barracks toward the main building. The communications room was small and cramped, with radio equipment that looked older than some of the soldiers using it. I found a chair and tuned in to the patrol frequency. The 4 men were still checking in regularly, reporting grid coordinates and terrain observations. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested any kind of threat. just routine chatter from people doing a job they'd done many times before. Through the window, I could see the last traces of sunlight disappearing behind the mountains to the west. The desert was taking on that purple-gray color that came just before full darkness. In a few minutes, the only light would be stars and whatever the patrol carried with them. Their radio chatter continued for another 10 minutes. Position updates, status reports, casual conversation between team members. I started to relax, thinking that maybe Meyer's paranoia was just that. Paranoia born from too much isolation and too many empty nights in the desert. Then, the radio went quiet. Not gradually, not with any indication of technical problems or distance issues. Just sudden, complete silence, where there had been voices moments before. I adjusted the frequency and tried calling them directly. "Patrol team, this is base communications. Please respond." Nothing. I tried again, then switched to their emergency frequency. Still nothing. Through the window, I could see 4 small points of light moving in the darkness where the patrol should be. Their flashlights were on now, visible as tiny stars against the black desert. But something was wrong with how they were moving. Instead of the steady, methodical progress you'd expect from a coordinated patrol, the lights were darting around erratically, zigzagging, stopping, then moving again in seemingly random directions. I grabbed a pair of binoculars from the communications desk and focused on the distant lights. What I saw made no sense. The 4 beams were scattered across a much wider area than they should have been, moving independently of each other in ways that suggested panic rather than tactical positioning. One light disappeared entirely, then another. I tried the radio again. "Patrol team, respond immediately. What is your status?" The remaining 2 lights continued their erratic movement for another few seconds. Then one of them went out. The last light moved frantically for perhaps 30 seconds before it too vanished, leaving nothing but empty darkness beyond the fence. I stared out at the desert, binoculars pressed to my eyes, looking for any trace of the 4 soldiers who had walked out just minutes earlier. There was nothing out there now. No lights, no movement, no sign that anyone had ever been there at all. I walked back from the communications room in a daze, my mind still trying to process what I'd witnessed. Every logical explanation I could think of fell apart after what I'd seen. The barracks felt different when I stepped inside. Meyer sat on his bunk, weapon taken apart across his lap for cleaning, but he looked up when I entered. He didn't ask what I'd seen or whether I'd checked the patrol communications. He just watched me with a steady look, waiting. I pulled the crumpled paper from my pocket and read through the 5 rules again. The words that had seemed ridiculous a few hours earlier now seemed serious. Stay inside after sunset. Lock the door by 11. Never look out windows after midnight. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. Meyer reassembled his rifle with mechanical precision. "Since I've been here. And before that?" "Before that, too." I checked my watch. 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes until the door needed to be locked. I walked over to the metal door and tested the handle, then turned the deadbolt. It clicked shut, sounding weirdly loud in the quiet room. Meyer finished with his gun and put it close to his bunk. He'd already checked the window locks twice while I was gone, but now he did it again. He tested each metal blind and checked each latch. He moved like someone going through steps he'd done 1,000 times before. I sat on my own bunk and pulled out my gun, checking the magazine even though I'd done it 3 times since arriving. Meyer's behavior made me think our guns might not be enough for whatever we were dealing with. The compound outside had gone completely quiet. No voices, no movement, no sounds from the other buildings. Even the generator that powered the lights had settled into a steady buzz that made the silence feel even deeper. At 11:30 p.m. exactly, the first scratching started. The sound came from somewhere along the outside wall of our building, like fingernails dragging across metal. Not random scratching, but patterns that moved from left to right, then back again. I looked at Meyer, who was lying on his bunk staring at the ceiling with his hands behind his head. "Meyer," a voice called from outside. Clear and distinct, just loud enough to carry through the walls. My blood went cold. That was Sergeant Wilson's voice, one of the patrol members I'd watched disappear. "Meyer, we need help out here. We got separated and Johnson's hurt pretty bad." The voice came from directly outside our window. I started to turn toward the sound, but Meyer held up a hand without moving his head. "Don't look," he said quietly. "Thompson, you there too?" Now it was Johnson speaking, the same voice I'd heard on the radio hours earlier. "We're right outside. Can you open up?" The desperation in the voice sounded completely real. The fear, the pain, the urgency of someone who needed immediate medical attention. I felt a strong urge to help fellow soldiers in distress. "They got us turned around out there," Wilson's voice continued. "GPS is fried and Rodriguez lost too much blood. We need to get inside." I grabbed my gun and looked at Meyer. He lay still on his bunk, staring at the ceiling like nothing was happening. He was breathing evenly, like he was focusing on something specific. The voices got more desperate, pleading, describing injuries that sounded horrible, begging us to open the door. They knew our names, our ranks, details about the base that made it seem like these really were the missing patrol members. But I remembered the lights going out one by one. I remembered the radio silence that had followed their last transmission. Whatever was outside might sound like Wilson and Johnson, but it couldn't be them. The pounding started around midnight. Not gentle knocking, but hard hammering against the metal walls. The voices got wild, saying they could see movement in the darkness around them, how something was coming closer. "Please, we don't have much time." Rodriguez's voice joined the others. "Whatever took Martinez is coming back." I pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes, trying to block out the sounds. The banging got louder, more insistent, accompanied by scraping noises that suggested claws or tools being dragged across the metal exterior. At 12:15, the pounding stopped. For several minutes, complete silence returned to the compound. I started to relax, thinking whatever had been mimicking the patrol voices had moved on. Then gentle tapping began on the window behind my bunk. "Hey there." The voice was different now. Younger, playful, completely unlike the desperate military voices from before. "Don't be scared. I just want to talk." I kept my eyes fixed on the opposite wall, remembering Rule 3 about not looking out windows after midnight. "I know you're awake in there. David Thompson from Akron, Ohio, right? Your mom still working at that insurance office on Market Street?" I was shocked by how familiar it felt. I hadn't told anyone here about my family or where I grew up. That information wasn't in my military records, and I definitely hadn't mentioned it to Meyer during our brief conversations. "And your little sister Rebecca, she's doing great at Ohio State, majoring in engineering, just like you wanted to before you enlisted. Smart girl." My hands started shaking. Rebecca's major wasn't common knowledge. She'd only declared it 2 months ago, and I'd been the only family member she'd told. "I know this must be confusing," the voice continued, still sounding friendly and conversational. "But I can explain everything if you just come to the window. There's something amazing happening out here. Something you need to see." The tapping became more rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass in a patient, almost musical pattern. "Your dad would understand. Remember how he used to take you camping up in the state park? How he'd point out constellations and tell you stories about explorers finding new worlds?" Tears started running down my face. My father had died when I was 16, and those camping trips were some of my most treasured memories. No one at this base could know about them. No one should have access to that information. "He'd want you to be brave, David. He'd want you to look." I pressed my palms against my ears, but the voice continued, describing childhood memories with perfect accuracy. My first dog, the treehouse my father and I had built, the exact words he'd spoken the night before his heart attack. Just a quick look, Just turn around and see what's out there." "It's beautiful, David. It's everything your father told you it would be." The tapping stopped, but I could hear breathing just on the other side of the glass. Slow, patient breathing that suggested whatever was out there was willing to wait as long as necessary. I kept my back to the window and my eyes on the wall in front of me. Meyer had rolled onto his side but remained still, his rifle within arm's reach. He was awake, listening, but showing no interest in checking out the sounds. At 2 a.m., heavy knocking sounded through the door. "Thompson, it's Meyer." The voice was identical to my roommate's, down to the flat tone and precise pronunciation. "We have an emergency situation that requires your immediate assistance." I looked at the real Meyer, who was now sitting up on his bunk. He caught my eye and shook his head slightly. "Thompson, respond immediately. That's an order." The knocking became more insistent, the voice taking on the authoritative edge that Meyer used when discussing security protocols. "There's been a breach in the perimeter fence. I need you to come with me to assess the damage." I remembered Rule 4. If someone knocks, make them say your full name first. I walked to the door but kept my hand away from the locks. "Say my full name," I called out. The knocking stopped. Complete silence followed for about a minute. Then footsteps moved away from the door, heavy boots on concrete that got quieter until they were gone. Meyer nodded and got back on his bunk. He closed his eyes like he was trying to sleep, though I couldn't imagine how anyone could rest after what we'd just been through. I stayed awake all night, sitting with my back against the wall. The voices came back several more times, trying different approaches, but they never again pretended to be Meyer, and they never said my full name. When morning light started showing through the edges of the metal blinds, everything finally got quiet. I'd been sitting against the wall for hours, my gun in my lap as everything stayed quiet. The metal blinds blocked most of the darkness, but thin lines of gray had started to show around their edges. My eyelids felt like sandpaper, and every muscle in my body hurt from sitting in the same tense position since the voices had finally stopped. Meyer looked like he was sleeping, but I was pretty sure he was just as alert as I was. His breathing had the controlled rhythm of someone pretending to rest while staying ready. His rifle was close by, and I'd noticed him change positions several times during the night, always keeping himself facing where trouble might come from. The loud wail of an alarm broke the silence at exactly 4:30 a.m. I didn't wait. As soon as that sound hit my ears, I dropped to the floor and crawled under my bunk, pushing my body against the cold concrete. The space between the bed frame and the floor was tight, but I got as far back as possible, remembering Rule 5. Meyer did the same thing right away, rolling off his bunk and getting under his own bed quickly. Neither of us spoke or asked what was happening. The alarm meant one thing, and we both knew exactly what to do. The sound was so loud, bouncing off the concrete walls and metal surfaces so hard it made my teeth hurt. It wasn't like a fire alarm or a security alert. This was more urgent, like an air raid siren made to cut through any other sound and get your attention. Through all the noise, I heard our barracks door open. The locks that Meyer had checked over and over, the deadbolt that I'd personally closed and tested multiple times, the security measures that had kept us safe through hours of weird harassment. None of it mattered now. The door just opened with a metal groan that somehow carried over the blaring alarm. Heavy footsteps came into the room, each one hitting the floor hard enough I could feel it through the concrete. But there was something else with the footsteps, a wet dragging sound that scraped across the floor with the movement, like something being pulled along behind whatever had just entered our space. I kept my breathing slow, taking quiet breaths through my nose. The concrete felt ice cold against my cheek, and I could smell dust and metal polish from the bed frame above my head. The thing moved through our room with purpose, not rushing or searching wildly, but checking every corner. Furniture crashed and scraped as it was pushed aside or knocked over. My desk chair hit the wall with a bang I could hear even over the alarm. Something that sounded like my footlocker being flipped made noise from the other side of the room. Then came the sniffing. Long, wet sniffs that went on longer than any human breath. The creature was smelling the air, like a predator tracking prey. Each sniff was followed by a pause, then movement to a new spot for more smelling. Through the gap under my bed frame, I saw what had come into our room. Huge clawed feet, each at least twice as big as a human foot, moved across my view. The claws looked more like curved metal hooks than natural ones, scraping against the concrete with each step. What made my stomach turn was the dark liquid dripping from them, leaving wet stains on the floor that spread out. The feet came closer to where I was hiding, each step making that dragging sound. Whatever this thing was pulling behind it, it was heavy enough to leave its own trail across the concrete. The scraping sound made me think it was something made of metal or bone being dragged along the ground. The creature stopped right beside my bed. I could hear it breathing just inches from my face, deep and labored like it was working hard to be here. The sniffing got stronger, like it had found something interesting right where I was hiding. Those claws were so close I could have touched them. The dark fluid kept dripping, making a pool that showed the dim emergency lighting coming through the blinds. Each drop hit the concrete with a soft splash I could somehow hear over the alarm. I closed my eyes and stayed completely still. My muscles hurt from not moving and my lungs felt tight from controlling my breathing. But I didn't move at all. The breathing got heavier, like it was getting annoyed. The creature moved its weight, and I felt the bed frame above me shake a little. It was leaning down, bringing its head closer to the floor, still smelling around where I was hiding. Minutes felt like hours. The thing moved around the bed, checking different angles, but never seemed to find exactly where I was. The wet, dragging sound continued as it checked Myers' side of the room, with more crashes and furniture being thrown around. Through it all, the alarm kept going, super loud. My ears had gone numb from the noise, and I could feel it in my chest. But I understood now why the alarm was needed. It wasn't just a warning, it was cover, hiding any small sounds that might give away where we were hiding. The creature walked around the room again, those clawed feet passing by me twice more. Each time it stopped, sniffed, and moved on, seeming more annoyed. Whatever it was looking for, it wasn't finding it. After what felt like forever, the alarm stopped suddenly. The quiet was almost more shocking than the noise had been. My ears rang in the silence and I could hear my own heartbeat. The creature's breathing was clearer now, raspy and wet like something with damaged lungs. It made one final walk around the room, moving faster now, with less careful searching and more angry movement. Furniture crashed harder and I heard what sounded like claws scraping across the metal walls, leaving deep marks. Then the dragging sound moved toward the door. The heavy footsteps followed, each one with that wet scraping that had filled the last 20 minutes. The creature paused at the doorway for a moment and I heard one final angry sniff before it left. The door stayed open behind it, but no other sounds came from the hallway. Whatever had visited us was gone, at least for now. I made myself wait another full hour before moving. Every minute was painful as my muscles begged for relief and my mind kept playing back what I'd just seen. But Myers' rules had kept me alive this long, and I wasn't about to break them by coming out too early. When I finally crawled out from under the bed, the mess was worse than I'd thought. Both desks had been flipped over, their stuff scattered across the floor. My footlocker was on its side with the lid completely torn off, and my gear was thrown everywhere like someone had searched through it in a rage. Deep claw marks cut into the concrete walls in parallel lines, each groove at least an inch deep from floor to ceiling. But the worst part was the dark stains that covered almost everything. The same fluid I'd seen dripping from those huge claws had been spread throughout the room, leaving weird patterns on the walls, the flipped furniture, and the floor. The stuff looked like something between blood and oil, and it smelled metallic in a way that made my stomach turn. Meyer got out from under his own bed, moving with the same careful way he'd shown all night. He looked at the mess without any emotion, like this was just another normal thing after his 2 years and 4 months at this place. He picked up his rifle and checked it, then began collecting his scattered gear step by step. The same careful attention to detail, the same thorough approach to every task, as if our room hadn't just been torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. I stood in the middle of the mess, still trying to understand what had happened. The rules had worked. We'd followed them exactly, and we'd survived. But looking at the claw marks in the concrete walls, I knew our survival had been a close call. I waited until the light around the metal blinds had brightened to actual daylight before I even considered approaching the door. My body ached from hours of tension, and the destroyed state of our room reminded me how close we'd come to something far worse than death. I picked my way across the mess that used to be our living space, stepping carefully around the pools of that metallic-smelling fluid. I slowly turned the door handle, half expecting resistance from locks that had somehow magically re-engaged themselves. The morning air hit my face as I cracked the door open, carrying the smell of desert sage and dust. No sounds of movement came from anywhere in the compound. No voices, no equipment being moved, no radio chatter from the communications building, just the whisper of wind across sand and the distant noise of the generator that kept our lights running. I opened the door wider and stepped outside, my boots crunching on concrete that showed no signs of the previous night's disturbance. The bright morning light made everything look normal again, almost peaceful. The same weathered buildings, the same rusted chain-link fence, the same empty guard towers that had seemed so ordinary when I'd arrived just 2 days ago. But the compound was completely empty. No personnel moved between buildings. No vehicles sat in the motor pool. The mess hall windows showed dark interiors with no signs of activity. Even the operations center, which should have maintained a 24-hour watch, appeared abandoned. I walked toward the main building, looking around for any sign of the missing patrol or the other soldiers I'd met my first day. The armory building caught my attention as I passed, and I detoured to check the small window in its reinforced door. The interior storage racks showed obvious gaps where equipment should have been. 4 rifle slots stood empty, along with corresponding spaces for tactical gear, night vision equipment, and field packs. Everything the patrol had carried when they'd walked through that gate was still missing, along with the men who'd taken it. Movement near the main building made me turn. Meyer sat on a concrete bench outside the operations center, his rifle taken apart across his lap in neat, organized components. He worked with the same obsessive attention I'd seen since my arrival, but in the morning light it looked different. Less like paranoia and more like practical preparation for known threats. I approached him slowly, still processing the complete absence of anyone else in the compound. He looked up when I got close, quickly checking my appearance before returning to his cleaning routine. "Where is everyone?" I asked. "Depends who you mean by everyone." "The other soldiers, the duty officer, the personnel I saw my first day here." Meyer attached the bolt carrier to his rifle and cycled the action twice, checking the mechanism with practiced movements. "Some assignments are temporary." I stared at him, waiting for more explanation. When none came, I pressed further. "What happened to the patrol? Wilson, Johnson, Rodriguez, Martinez? Where are they?" "They didn't make it back." The matter-of-fact delivery made my stomach clench. No emotion, no regret, just a simple statement of fact delivered while cleaning a weapon that might be the only thing standing between us and whatever had torn apart our room. "That's it? They didn't make it back? So we just forget about them?" Meyer looked up from his rifle, studying my face with the same blank look he'd given me when we first met. "What would you like me to say? That we should mount a rescue operation? File a missing persons report? Something. Anything that acknowledges 4 soldiers just disappeared. Acknowledging it doesn't change it." He reassembled the rifle with mechanical precision, each component clicking into place with practiced efficiency. and it doesn't make the next night any easier. I sat down on the bench beside him, still trying to understand what I'd seen. The voices that had known personal details about my family. The creature with claws that could tear through concrete. The rules that had somehow kept us alive through it all. What are those things? Things that hunt at night. That's not an answer. Meyer finished his weapon inspection and set the rifle across his knees. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked directly at me for more than a few seconds. His gray eyes looked tired, like he'd seen too much bad stuff and just learned to live with it. Some deployments require different types of survival skills, he said. This is one of them. Why here? What's so important about this particular patch of desert that the military would station personnel in a place where they get hunted by monsters? Meyer shrugged. The government has reasons for monitoring certain areas that soldiers aren't cleared to understand. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, just like the one he'd given me the day before. It looked brand new. Here, he said, holding it out to me. Your copy got destroyed last night. I took the paper and unfolded it, reading through the 5 rules again. The words looked exactly the same, but they meant something more serious now. These weren't suggestions or guidelines. They were the difference between surviving until dawn and becoming another missing person report that would never be filed. How many? I asked. How many what? How many soldiers have been stationed here? How many didn't make it? Meyer thought about the question while checking his gun, doing the same careful check he'd done with his rifle. New people usually don't make it through their first night without proper training. I was shocked. I'd only survived because Meyer had given me the rules and made sure I memorized them. Without that training, I would have opened the door when the voices started pleading for help. I would have looked out the window when something that knew my family's secrets called my name. I would have come out from under the bed when the alarm stopped. How long? I asked. How long is this deployment supposed to last? Standard tour is 18 months. 18 months. Almost 550 nights of following those rules, hiding under beds while things with metal claws looked for human prey. So many nights of voices that could copy anyone, creatures that could rip apart concrete walls, and weird threats that the military apparently thought were just part of the job. You need to start maintaining your weapons more carefully, Meyer said, returning his sidearm to its holster. What you experienced last night is routine. It happens every night, and your gear needs to be ready every time. I looked out across the empty compound toward the fence line and the endless desert beyond. The morning light made it all look peaceful, almost beautiful in how plain it was. But I knew that when the sun set, this place would turn into something else entirely. Something that required rules about staying hidden and never looking out windows. Get used to the routine, Meyer continued, standing up and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. It's the only way to make it through. He walked to the barracks, leaving me alone on the bench with my new copy of the rules. It hit me that my deployment would be months of these nightly ordeals. Not combat like you'd expect, but a different kind of warfare against enemies that regular military tactics couldn't handle. I looked at the empty desert beyond the fence. I knew that to survive this assignment, I'd have to accept that some military duties involved threats that normal training never covered. The rules weren't suggestions. They were the only thing keeping me alive for 18 months instead of becoming another casualty that would never show up in any official record. The generator buzzed in the distance, and somewhere in the compound, a door creaked in the morning breeze. Other than that, the outpost was quiet, just waiting for another sunset and whatever would come out of the darkness when night fell.